support. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show.
Good morning and welcome to a Friday Benjamin Dixon Morning Show. I am your host, Anoa Changa. I'm sad because my time with you is coming to an end today, but I'm sure you'll be happy to have been back on Monday. Today, it's Friday. It's Friday the 13th. I don't know about y'all if you ever grew up thinking like today was like a suspicious day. I think it's an auspicious day. I love that word. But it's Friday the 13th, sending many blessings and I hope everyone has a good day or is already having a great start to their day. Shout out to my kiddo. He's going to go take his driver's test a little later this morning. So hopefully we'll have a third driver. Sigh for my insurance dollars, but my insurance, monthly insurance. But it's really exciting to help my kids, venture into the adult world. Side note, if you have insurance commissioners or anything like that happening down ballot in your elections coming up, if you have primaries coming up, check out who's running for insurance commissioner, the price of insurance, some of the different charges a lot of us experience, who is in that position, or it might be called something different in your state. It really does matter. Who is making those decisions and who is actually trying to make sure that folks aren't paying exorbitant prices just because they live in a particular zip code, et cetera. That's my little plug for down ballot elections for the day. But I think we have another Black History Month fact this morning. Before we get to our guest, I'm super excited to be joined by attorney Nora Benavidez, also a good friend of mine. But I think we have a Black History Month fact first from Dr. Mac's calendar, blackheritagedays.com. Let's check it out.
On May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls smuggled his wife and their 3 children aboard the ship, Planter. At the start of the Civil War, he had joined the Confederate forces and become a member of the crew. He sailed the Planter out of Charleston Harbor and turned it over as war booty to Union forces, ensuring freedom for his family and 12 Black crew members. Impressed by his heroics, President Lincoln named Smalls a pilot in the Union Navy. He was later promoted to captain, making him the only Black captain during the Civil War. Adapted from Black Heritage Day 4 calendar by author, lecturer, and civil rights activist Dr. Carl Mack.
Amazing. This is such a great, shout out to Dr. Mack. This is such a great tool to have. I know I'm definitely bookmarking it for my own just coverage and, today in history type posts in the future. And you learn something every day. Like I did not know, I'm not sure if I knew about Captain Smalls or not, but that was a great little tidbit to start off our day. Now, joining me this morning is Nora Benavidez. Nora is with PEN America. And Nora has all these fabulous titles. I always get them confused, but Nora is doing amazing work at PEN America around platform accountability, disinformation, is a First Amendment, I would say one of the best First Amendment experts in the country. Folks should be booking Nora left and right instead of some of these pasty commentators they tend to go for. But she's also someone who has helped me really navigate and understand the ways in which these issues at a very basic level, right? Like a lot of times we talk about the First Amendment, it's either very uninformed, as we see with Elon Musk, or it is extremely highly academic and not accessible in a lot of ways. And so we tend to avoid these conversations. But Nora and I have known each other for quite some time because of her work representing, protesters and other folks here in Georgia. And she just did incredible work while she was at PEN America previously as a free expressions counsel as well. So Nora, thank you so much for joining me this morning. And what exactly is your title at Free Press? Tell us a little bit about your Free Press work, please.
Noah, I love seeing you anytime you do some of the best work. And it is too generous that you say all those things about me, because you are writing and covering stories with the headlines and the content and the experts that we need. And so I hope we get to talk about some of that as well.
Absolutely.
I work at Free Press. We are a media and tech justice organization. I am our senior counsel and director of digital justice and civil rights, which is a very long title. But it really tries to get at that we know our online world shapes so much of what happens offline. What are the civil rights implications for everyone, especially communities of color? How can we think about things like disinformation as affecting our democracy? And how do we fight against the digital threats to engagement, to equity, to really feeling like we are each empowered, making decisions for ourselves?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, Nora, we started having these conversations, I mean, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years ago now, even before you went on to Penn. Can you talk to me about some of these threats we are experiencing in our digital world? I mean, I know there's offline and online threats that we're seeing happening, but can you just talk to me some about, put it in context for what are we talking about when we're talking about threats to, Black and brown communities, communities of color in terms of digital equity and ways that, online ability to express ourselves is being, challenged and curtailed?
Well, there are a lot of layers. I would start by saying there are many people around the country that still don't even have internet. And that permeates Native American populations, Black communities. That's just like a baseline that some people still aren't able to literally connect into what most of us have, I would say, all the time. Think about how many devices you have on your table right now. I have 2. Some people still have none. And if they do, they're paying the little bits and pieces, and then they go to a specific part of a reservation or elsewhere to get access. So that's one. And then beyond that, once you're really connected to the digital world, I think so many years ago, we imagined, all of us, that this was going to help make connection and conversation easier. And sometimes it does. Like, I look at your Twitter feed, I look at the ways that I can connect with people on social media, and it's actually pretty amazing in some ways. You find friends, you find media opportunities where people connect and talk about stuff. You get into fights. Maybe sometimes they're constructive. And then there's all this other stuff, though, like the stuff that I think we can call it something between the junk we read, the rumors and the conspiracy theories we see, the advertising that might frankly be something we enjoy, but it's actually tied to the fact that social media companies are gathering, collecting, and then leveraging our data. So when you search for something like a Black hair care product and then you get ads for it, that is kind of a scary implication for you. So you're seeing ads. Maybe you want to see them, but still, I find that kind of creepy. You also then might see other things. You might see political ads that are full of disinformation. You could see calls for violence. And over the last several years, what we've learned is that there has been a rise on social media of some of the worst content. And it isn't just because you or me or anyone else tuning in today likes that stuff and seeks it out. We know that social media companies are actually amplifying it. They're really preferencing that stuff. It makes them money because it's so controversial. And so extremist content, for example, gets engaged and boosted 6 times more than other content. We also know that companies like Twitter have amplified disinformation for Latino and Spanish-speaking voters around the 2020 election to really disincentivize and disenfranchise them through the voting process. Over the 2016 and 2018 and 2020 elections, Black voters were targeted with various kinds of narratives that made them feel their vote wouldn't count. And so altogether, there's sort of this like noise and chaos where you don't quite know how to sift through information. And it's a huge daunting task because each person's news feed looks different. So we don't even really ever get a sense of what the problem is at scale.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, Nora, you were just talking some about the way in which the various platforms, I mean, you mentioned the issue of Latino voters in particular. I know from some of the work that y'all have done that Facebook and it still allowed, disinformation around COVID in particular to continue that was in Spanish, even as it was taking down English disinformation. And so there's just like a lack of investment when it is in a non-English language, it seems like, to even ensure and make sure this information is being curtailed. But I wanted to ask you about like the content moderation stuff, right? I mean, we're seeing a lot of conversation about how it interferes with the First Amendment. We're denying people, those people who are advocating for content moderation or want the sites to make sure they're moderating content are denying people's right, protected First Amendment right. Can you talk to me about like the importance and value of content moderation, as well as what does it have to do with the First Amendment?
Oh, this is one of my favorite questions because people love to say, I'm being censored on social media. And I try to very kindly disavow people. I say, social media companies are private companies. The First Amendment really only is intended to create guardrails so that the government doesn't infringe on your rights. And I hope we can talk more about some of the First Amendment issues. But that means that on social media, if a company decides to ban you or take some of your content down or put a label on it, or for anyone else, let's say former President Donald Trump, that is not a First Amendment violation. There are, throughout the world, instances where many people use social media as their lifeline to information. So when content gets removed or somehow labeled with something that makes them not engage, you can ask the question of how does that affect free expression, the ability to learn about and have access to information. But it is not a First Amendment issue. When it comes to then content moderation, given that we know there's been this rise in disinformation, in hateful content, calls for violence, many of which, let's just use an example, led to the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. The question becomes, what should social media companies be doing? Many of them say, we're like a public square. We're not going to be the arbiters of truth. That's their favorite line. And yet we have more and more and more evidence that what they actually are doing leads to things like genocide, horrid human rights abuses throughout the world. We just saw an election in the Philippines at the beginning of this week, and we knew that disinformation ran rampant with sort of narratives for whichever candidate was in charge and in power. And so the question then is, well, what do social media companies do here? And people like Elon Musk, other people who somehow think that free speech should flourish without content moderation, have no real sense of how these platforms operate. And that the noisiest, most toxic, most hateful stuff will always rise to the top. And so we need moderation and we need enforcement. Some of the work that we do at Free Press is really centered on how do we build pressure for social media companies and other internet service companies to do better. They know how to do better. I'll give you just one quick anecdote. In the lead up to the 2020 election here in the United States, Facebook actually implemented what were called break glass measures. They knew that there was going to be so much junk and hate and lies. And so they put a number of mechanisms in place to minimize the reach and the visibility of that content. They did that only for a short period in November of 2020. And then they disbanded their civic integrity team. They slashed the budget for all of this. They stopped putting those mechanisms in place. And what followed for the next month was just this horrible rise in the worst content. And while it may not have been the direct cause of January 6th, many researchers say, you look at the two things and we know that online world has offline consequence. So companies like Facebook and now Meta have to do better. They have to fix their algorithms to stop preferencing this stuff. And globally, they have to invest, as you mentioned, in non-English content. They're investing 87% of their resourcing on English alone. And yet we see over 25 other languages spoken in major countries around the world that are getting just piddly cents relative to the major budget that these companies have. So we need to learn more about them, and they need to really understand that they are affecting and eroding democracies.
That's powerful when you talked about the way in which it can affect and erode democracy, particularly when we hear so much from folks like, oh, Twitter's not real life or Facebook's not real life or whatever. But what you said, that the digital world can have offline real world consequences, just thinking a little bit more about the criminalization of or just the First Amendment as it relates to protests. You had this amazing thread yesterday where you were really contextualizing on Twitter. Nora had this really dope thread contextualizing the very statutes that attempt to criminalize protests and with the First Amendment. And so when we're talking about First Amendment issues and violations like states criminalizing protests, that actually does raise a First Amendment issue. Is that correct?
Oh, no, I love to chop it up with you about protest rights. I think more than anything, because so many people don't make the connection that getting out, standing on a sidewalk, walking on a highway, those are rights. And we've somehow internalized this false narrative. I think of it as disinformation, that protest is inherently criminal. People say that it is violent, that rioting happens. There's sort of these links people make in the words that they use when they describe public gatherings. And over the last several days, the last several weeks, we've seen, in light of the draft ruling in Dobbs, which would potentially gut Roe v. Wade, so many abortion activists have come out and started protesting. And many are weighing in. Democrats are saying, don't go overboard on your protests. Republicans are then saying, well, there are certain statutes that criminalize protest, and we have to actually know what our rights are, and that the First Amendment will supersede these other criminal statutes that say you can't protest in certain places because protest and standing there is in and of itself a criminal act. It isn't. There are some regulations that the government can put in place. And what we call those are time, place, and manner restrictions. So the idea that you're standing outside Justice Kavanaugh's house with a bullhorn at 2 a.m. may be a problem. But the idea that you're standing on the sidewalk near his house during the day with a number of people with signs is a very different issue. And so people are currently pulling from different places, trying to create the narrative that we don't have protest rights. And so I always try to remind people, let's take a beat and understand why the First Amendment is first. We have long known in this country that the First Amendment is essential for democracy to work. It's the only reason we're able to all come together and be heard by you, by my fellow citizens. And it really is essential. It's sort of part of the fabric of how this country needs to work. But we've somehow gotten to an upset balance in this digital era that the worst stuff gets heard. And part of what we all need to remember is we all have rights. Unfortunately, the people who are currently criminalized are Black people, other people of color, people who are trying to push for progress. And if it means that much to silence those voices, we have to think about why progress is considered that dangerous. It should never be considered dangerous. Progress and protest are the fabric of America. Whether it is long ago when we had journalist rights to protect those reporters that published the Pentagon Papers, the civil rights movement, which at the time was criminalized. Black activists and leaders were beaten for trying to literally just march on a sidewalk. BLM, tech whistleblowers. These are all little through lines that speech is essential as a tool for progress. And so we have to upset this narrative that somehow we can't engage, and if we do, we'll be arrested, because that is what leaders now want us to think as a form of silencing social change.
And just going a little bit further into the First Amendment, because I know there's a whole gamut of stuff that you cover. About a month or so ago, you and I were talking about when the New York Times editorial board came out with that ridiculous editorial about the real battle around the First Amendment. I just wonder if you could just talk to me, put it in context for us, because there is this narrative that there is this battle around the First Amendment and certain people being silenced in cancel culture that doesn't seem to be matching matching up with the reality of what the real First Amendment struggle is about right now. So can you just talk to me some about what are we really seeing? And I mean, I know that's so broad because the First Amendment covers so many things: freedom of the press, right to protest, freedom of religion. I mean, it's like, what, 5 or 6 different things that are covered under the First Amendment itself.
I love it.
Can you talk to me just about, like, as we're wrapping up, what are the challenges we're really seeing right now facing in terms of the First Amendment?
Well, we're seeing a rise in what I call anti-democratic trends. Those are state and local efforts by legislators to criminalize our basic rights. And a lot of people will say things like, well, cancel culture is really the biggest threat we have right now to people expressing themselves. I think that's a pretty rarefied, sort of ivory towered take on what's really happening. The biggest threat that we see to free speech is the rise of this anti-democratic work. It is happening in Florida. It is happening in Georgia. It is happening in Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona. I can rattle off the dozens of states where we are seeing a bunch of things. One is hundreds of proposals in these states to increase penalties for protest. And just a reminder, protest is a right. Things like driving on a highway, those are licenses we get, licenses to drive. But protest is an essential First Amendment right. We also are seeing the rise of these kinds of legislation that would criminalize anything related to voting. That is, people who give out water while people are waiting to vote, or election poll workers are now no longer allowed to do certain things. And so under the fear of being arrested, people will stop protesting, stop making sure that someone who doesn't speak English has access to the proper voting ballot. We're also then seeing other things. In Florida and in Texas, there have been efforts to make sure that social media companies cannot remove candidates who promote disinformation. Just yesterday in Texas, something happened where a judge said that is a fine piece of legislation to proceed. And if the state wants to make sure that social media companies have to keep authoritarian voices on, so be it. That is a very troubling precedent we're setting. We're going to be seeing now less access for people like you and me, less ability to engage in democracy. If you're not protesting, if you're not voting, if you really, truly cannot use the avenues where speech is essential, and the people in power promoting lies are given an unfettered landscape to do so, that is democracy in peril.
Nora, I really appreciate you for joining us this morning on the Benjamin Dixon Morning Show, and just dropping a few nuggets to get us started with our day. Please let folks know where they can find you and how they can follow more of your work.
Well, I am always on Twitter at Attorney Nora. Check me out, ask me questions. I want us to start building a better understanding of free speech together. We have to have communication and dialogue. And then I would love for you to check out the new work we are doing at Free Press at changetheterms.org. We are launching an effort called Fix the Feed, which is a big campaign ahead of the midterm elections this November to make sure that social media companies protect democracy every day and all over the world. So check us out.
Amazing. Nora Benavides, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm going to kick it back over to the team. This has been a great past few days with y'all in the Benjamin Dixon Morning Show land. I think up next is On the Clock with Miss Georgia Fort. I'm Anoa Changa, and it has been my pleasure to be your host this week. I'll see you guys again soon. Peace.